China is taking very, very close notes at the moment on how not only the Americans and Ukraine is responding to effectively, because a lot of the Chinese military equipment is it's Russian equipment with a nice fresh coat of paint, but how the world has rallied around it. Russia has a very different economy to China, so China knows that if the world were to really buckle down and do sanctions like they have to the Russians, that would really, really hurt China.
Being an Australian, what do you think that gives you in terms of a unique perspective or advantage that maybe people other places wouldn't have?
It's that perfect middle ground when you are a conflict journalist, that you're rich and well-known enough as an Australian that the most visas are a bit easier, but you're not so useful like an American that you're worth kidnapping. So it's that Goldilocks and right in the middle of, that Australians are probably well-suited to be conflict journalists. That and, we're used to everything around us trying to kill us, and that kind of just comes with living here for in the country for a while.
Yeah, and for those who maybe aren't familiar, obviously you have a bit of this gallows humor too. I wonder what is being a conflict journalist, and the threats of that have to do with how that's kind of shaped your attitudes about things.
I think you need to have a bit of levity about things. I think it's you obviously have to take things very seriously, but I think you need to also be able to disconnect a bit and also be very personable. Quite often 90% of this job, everyone imagines it's, sitting in a trench and, getting shot at all day. And I can tell you the majority of it is sitting in boardrooms or, bars in terrible places and just talking to people. That's effectively what most of the job is. As a classic kind of example of what I'm talking about here, if you ask a general, where are your troops heading? He'll say, sorry, that's a classified secret. I can't tell you that. But if you go have drinks with his secretary, she'll tell you where the mail's going, and that'll give you a really good indication of where the general's going. But that requires, chatting and meeting people and making contacts. And even when I've been back here in Australia, it's still lots and lots of phone calls every week, just keeping those connections up and sort of, hey, what's going on over here? And hey, I've heard this rumor here. What's the substantiation of it? And going from there. So, as much as it's a bit weird that almost every conflict journalist has a bit of gallows humor to them, I think it's just it's a bit of a coping mechanism of, if you get bogged down on one issue too much, you can't really be objective about it. And it's a really difficult one where you might be in a conflict, whether it be, Azerbaijan, Armenia, or Russia, Ukraine, or anything like that. And if you're, you might personally have an opinion on which side you prefer or which side of the conflict you sit on, but you still have to try and give, an objective analysis of the situation. Because if you just go waving the flag going, Azerbaijan is the best country in the world, you're not changing anyone's mind. The people who are going to agree with you are already way in that camp. Whereas if you are, giving an objective analysis and kind of keeping your opinion out of it, then, you do have that hope of swaying these people in the middle who maybe haven't decided either way.
Let's talk about your show. I mean, the production value on your show, it's not like most podcasts. I feel like when I listen to your show, it's like an audio documentary. There's so much craft that's going into it. How did you develop this vision for your show?
So it's a very odd concept. So I've been a conflict journalist for a while. I'd come back and I had, this black book of all these names and wanted to do, was looking for a show like Red Line out there, something where long form, it's kind of that middle ground between, there's lots of great stuff on YouTube, but it's only 12, 20 minutes long, and you really can't get into a lot of the really niche details in 20 minutes. And then on the other hand, on this part of the spectrum, there are defense white papers who, I love the guys who write them, but good Lord, some of them are boring. They are 300 pages of obviously we've got to make sure we take into account the ARVs that are going up through this particular path. It's mind-numbingly boring. So it's kind of trying to find that middle ground of interesting but not too, did you know that Canada was a country? What? That kind of middle ground there. Weirdly enough, my first degree I did before I got into conflict journalism was in audio production. I used to be a sound guy and touring in bands and that was and recording artists and whatnot. So, I had this weird niche of being, doing the journalism on the ground, doing all that, but I was actually know how to operate the cameras, and being able to set up mics and mic everything and clean up audio. And it made I know when I listen to podcasts and I hear, pretty rough audio, I go, okay, look, it's fine, but I can hear when it's rough. So yeah, it was making sure it's that, cutting out the fat, but leaving in still an hour and a half of content. It's that, every episode starts with 3 hours of audio. So it's a lot to cut down, but you got to make sure it's all snappy. You're getting to the point. You got a narrative structure. And it's a combination of having a musician's background with a journalist background as well.
Yeah, and all that shows, and your conflict journalism background really, it shines too. And I heard you on another show, you're talking about how you could see the war in Ukraine coming from details like patterns in train traffic and things like that. What did you see leading up to the war in Ukraine?
So it's a very odd situation for us, because we were obviously, we'd heard the drums beating toward Ukraine, but the Russians had kind of done these operations before. And it was, it was this weird kind of in November, December, we were like, yeah, the Russians, it makes more sense for the Russians to just do the yearly operations they do, because the Russians do these grand operations across the country where they'll do things like put everyone on standby, and then how quickly can you get to Vladivostok, which is near Japan. If they were run these games next to Ukraine, they'd be treated very seriously. They'd send a message to the Biden administration. So we all kind of went, these are probably just exercises. But we were watching for key indicators. And then it kind of hit that, late January mark. And we started going, okay, this is getting weird. There are things that are popping up that we wouldn't see with exercises. So setting up large amounts of radio control, canceling some leave passes, which was a big sign. And we went, okay. But even analysts like myself still went, I see what the math leads up to. The math says invasion, but I don't know that answer. Like, it doesn't make sense. Like, what's the end game there? That's obviously going to be a catastrophe. There's not enough troops to do this properly. They're not well supplied enough. Like, if he's going to do it, it's going to be a catastrophe. Surely he's not that dumb. And it was this weird thing of you keep doing the math and it keeps saying invasion, and then you end up going, but that doesn't make sense. So, the week before it happened, then we saw the final big signs, which were effectively things like trains being requisitioned by the Russian government. A lot of officers had their leaves cut short. So, for instance, commanders in communications would be told to, I know you're on holiday, but you've got to get back to your station now. And then the big one that and also there was some share price stuff, like a RASK went up, which is a bit of a sign. But the big one was blood bags rocking up. That was happening on the Monday. The invasion was, I want to say Thursday. It was a Thursday when the invasion happened. And Monday is when the blood bags got there. And from that, we all knew, okay, that's the big one. Because once you take blood bags out, they do expire, and they expire very quickly. So most exercises, you'll get one or two idiots who will end up hurting themselves and they need blood bags, but you're not emptying a blood bank to go do an exercise. So that was Monday was a bit of a, okay, this is real. But it was a very weird sort of month of, we kept getting the reports and we kept seeing it, but going, he's not that dumb. Surely he's not that dumb. But apparently we were all wrong. He was that dumb.
So I want to get to that end game piece of it that we're getting at. But first, I'd really love your perspective on, what do you see happening right now? What does it look like to you in Ukraine right now?
So Ukraine has kind of gone into these different phases. So the first phase was this really quick blitzkrieg where the Russians kind of thought it was 2014. From what we understand, the Russians, had this impression, whether it be that Putin was just getting fed miffy information, whether it be just that he didn't think that, there was obviously some talk of Zelensky not being loved by a lot of Ukrainians. He thought that he could walk into Ukraine and, much like 2014, the whole thing would just fall over. Because when he walked in 2014, everyone threw their guns on the floor and said, no thanks. He even had former members of Ukrainian governments or Russia-leaning governments, flown into Belarus, ready to go. It was, we all kind of thought, okay, this thing's going to be over in a few days. Well, that's what Russia would think anyway. Once it ground down and it kind of went, okay, this is getting very expensive, we're losing a lot of men and this is not winning the war, Russia then had to move to a much cheaper, nastier strategy, which is effectively what they've done at the moment. For people who don't really study Russian strategy a lot, again, a Russian put it best to me is, car parks can't fight back, which is a really nasty way of saying, if rather than trying to take a village, it's far easier to just artillery the damn thing and turn it to rubble and walk over the top. So we saw the Russians in the sort of around the April area move from this mobile warfare with tanks and across a lot of fronts and pull back to just artillery doctrines because they have so much artillery. There's just piles and piles and piles of these old World War II style shells because it puts Ukraine in a bit of an odd position where the whole world is backing Ukraine and everyone's giving Ukraine all the equipment and everything they could possibly want, which is great. But now, if they lose, will that support disappear? So then you have all these cities in the east, like Lysychansk and Severodonetsk and all these sort of fairly no-name cities. They're not particularly strategically important. The whole of Ukraine's not going to go if the grain facilities at Severodonetsk go. But because the Ukrainians are stuck in this narrative of, if they pull back to much more defensible positions around, Zaporozhye or the Dnieper, that would mean retreating, and that would be people thinking they're losing, and then they may lose the funding and support and everything else that's coming in. So Russia is effectively going with this just artillery, just literally keeping it nice and cheap, not losing too many men, just bomb every single day, just keep it running in, hoping to just sort of wear the Ukrainians down and buy time. And I'm sure we'll get into the end game here a bit later on, but right now it is just Ukraine losing more and more men just to effectively just the constant churning of artillery in the east.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that point you said about being like fighting a car park. Yeah, when we were talking about this, some of my ex-military American friends were thinking, oh my gosh, to invade these cities, it'll be this horrible urban warfare, clearing apartment buildings. But the brutality, instead of just leveling places, is, as you said, it's simplifying.
Well, and you look at the first days of the war when they were using precision weapons. They were effectively targeting military facilities. Day 3 of the war in Australia, there was that photo of the woman who, the missile was slightly off and kind of put a bunch of scratches on her face. It's crazy to think that may, I know it was big. Obviously the war was very big, but that was someone who was injured rather than killed. It was a kind of very different to what it is now, because the Russians at that point were thinking, we don't want to break too many things because we're going to own this in 3 weeks. Now it's, look, we don't have enough precision weapons left. They are really scraping the bottom of the barrel here. Let's just go with dumb artillery and just level things as they go. And this is the doctrine they used in Grozny. This is the doctrine they've used in Syria. It's a very common Russian doctrine, and it's how most of the Russian military tends to operate, which is, again, one of those things that Russian analysts watch where we go, okay, when Russia does these offenses, whether they be into Georgia in 2008 or they be into Grozny in 1999, or whether they be, they are in Syria, effectively they tend to follow this really heavy artillery doctrine, and none of these kind of armored long columns that advance without infantry support, which is one of the things that really boggled kind of any analyst watching the satellite footage coming back before the invasion, going, yeah, we see the troops there, but it's not the usual layouts or patterns that we'd expect to see from the Russians. So, yeah, again, it's a lot of questions around this on, why they've just kind of thrown the standard Russian playbook out the window and gone with this, at the start, long armored, unsupported columns, and now back to usual business, which is just turning things to car parks.
Mm-hmm. So we're seeing this change from, at first, the assumption that Russia will take things very quickly and they should leave it relatively unscathed, and then to just leveling it to win. And now, what do you see as the step after that? What is the end game here, or what are the scenarios that could play out that you think?
So, at the very start, if you're going to steal a car, you're not going to smash the windshield as you steal it. You want the windshield intact so you can drive it away. But now that car is, you're not ever going to get that car. So now, who cares? Russia now, with the looks of it, is playing a bit of a long game. So they know they're not going to get a big win. They're not going to be able to march through the streets of Kiev. They're not going to make it to Lviv. They're not going to do any of that kind of stuff. That's just off the table. The casualties would be horrifying. They don't have the military support to do it. It's just off. So now we come down to what options they do have. So on a good day, so like great time for Russia, they would make a large offensive in the south around Mykolaiv, which they are starting to pick some stuff off around there, and push to Odessa, being the only real big Black Sea port the Ukrainians have left. If they could do that, that would be, that would be huge for the Russians. 2 seconds. Because it would allow the Russians to effectively make Ukraine into a landlocked nation, which would either mean the EU having to tax all their stuff coming across the border, or they would have to use Russian ports to get their stuff out. It would give them a land bridge to the Transnistrians in a breakaway republic in Moldova. It would be the biggest victory, and that would be great. Adding on top the fact that around Snake Island and around Odessa is where there's a bunch of new gas deposits discovered recently as well. Mm-hmm. So that'd be the big time, but it'd be really difficult to do. So one of my staff is currently in Mykolaiv and giving me some great reports from there. The defense on that road, because it is mostly one road between sort of running along the coast, the southern coast of Ukraine, is pretty horrific. Like, the Russians will lose a lot of men to take that. And if they throw that Hail Mary punch to go down there, it's not, it's not a certainty they take it. If the Ukrainians really start losing some men trying to take Kherson, it's possible, but I'd say it's less likely than more likely. And that's as much as we would know at this point, because we don't know if the Russians are going to, effectively chuck everything they have into that, go all in on this one big push, or they'll stop, or what's going on. A far more likely scenario, and the one we're all playing with at the moment, is effectively Russia buys time till winter. The fighting season in Ukraine particularly is going to start to slow down. The roads become absolute nonsense. It becomes cold and miserable. And as much as I love Ukraine and love my time there, it does become a miserable mess on those roads for a while. So the hope now is that effectively the West will start to lose attention, which is happening. I know in the first week of the conflict, I did 80-something interviews, and then, it started to drop off, and now, I do occasional ones on Ukraine, but I'm back to my usual kind of mix of all sorts of stuff. Even I like talking to sort of my in-laws and my mum, and, as a kind of bellwether on where the rest of society is. So, I'm not living in my little bubble. Those kind of people are starting to give me, oh, Ukraine, is that still going on? I'm like, oh, yeah, it's very much still going on. And Russia's making this calculation of, okay, well, who's, still keeping this going? Well, the Third World was very interested because the grain had stopped coming in, particularly important for Algeria, Egypt, Lebanon, Kenya, who were buying lots of Ukrainian grain, as well as guys who buy Russian fertilizer. They were very, very keen to get the war over, but now Russia's opened the grain ports in Odessa and in the eastern bits near Mariupol. The Third World's kind of stepped back a bit and gone, it's not our fight anymore. As long as we have grain, we're good. The Americans are heading into the midterms, and it is going to be a nasty midterms. So we're all expecting that the narrative on Ukraine will disappear even further from the American psyche, which is just, it happens every election cycle, and it's why Russia tends to do things around election cycles. It's the reason they walked into Georgia right before the 2008 election with Obama and McCain. The Europeans are the big one, because obviously this is right on their doorstep. They are very interested in what happens. Right now, gas prices in places like the UK, France are at an all-time high. They are disgustingly high in these countries. And that's summer. This is the bit of the year when gas is usually at its cheapest. I'm talking a third of what you expect to pay in winter. So Russia is making that calculation of, okay, winter, we turn the gas back a little bit even further, and we're going to start to hit sort of 9 times usual price gas in a lot of Western Europe. Now that will put pressure on a lot of these political parties to go, okay, this is really, really hurting our economies, particularly as a lot of these guys are trying to get out of the COVID recession. And if they see their November, December numbers coming back, which are usually uptick in retail with Christmas coming, and that's not there, that's going to really freak out a lot of your economists. So Russia will then probably start running ads going, look, we can turn the gas back on, just, end the war and we can turn the gas back on. And it won't be overt. It'll be all behind the scenes, but they'll be pushing for Zelensky to say, hey, look, you need to wrap this up. We need to get our economies back on track. We love you, Ukraine, but we're all dying over here. Because again, a lot of these political parties will have elections coming up. And if you have all your political establishment saying, we stand with Ukraine, but, your far rights, particularly your Russia-backed parties, saying, elect us into power, we'll cut the gas price in 10th. Putin said he'll supply gas overnight. And to a lot of families who are living paycheck to paycheck, they may be enough to push them over the edge. And that's a very big worry inside the European community at the moment. Because again, people, you poll most Europeans, yep, they completely stand with Ukraine. If you say, are you happy to pay an extra $300-400, a month for that? That's when you start to get problematic. And you might see your Hungaries, your Slovakias, your Bulgarias, those kind of guys who might be the first to start going, maybe. Because again, even if the pie in the sky guys go, okay, look, we can get gas from elsewhere. We can get it from Qatar or Bahrain or Saudi Arabia. Great. First of all, they would need to ramp up production, which they're not ramping up fast enough to be able to handle European winter. And B, if you get it from, let's say, Qatar, you would have to get it out of the ground and then refine it and then freeze it and then put it in a ship and then sail it all the way around the Mediterranean, all the way to the top of Europe. Then you need to regasify it. And terminals are not available very much in Europe because they don't get much of their gas from outside sources. It all just comes from Russia and eastward. You need to regasify it and put it back in the pipelines, which again, the infrastructure is not meant to go this way, it's meant to go that way. So Europe's really not ready for winter. So it is going to really, really hurt. And there's a lot of people worried that they'll start to put pressure on Zelensky. And now then your question is, does Zelensky actually make a deal? Because I speak with lots of Ukrainian soldiers all the time. I just met with one of the Ukrainian brigadier generals a couple of days ago. And he was saying, yep, no, we'll fight this to the end. And that's even if Zelensky got his arm twisted by Macron and the entire European community saying, look, wrap this up. And Zelensky said to the people, look, we need to accept it. We'll lose, Donetsk and Mariupol, but we'll maintain everything else. And that's fine. Does the European army go for it? I mean, these guys are still pretty motivated at this point. So yeah, again, there's so many questions up in the air, and that's the kind of the main scenario we're all playing with at the moment. Mm-hmm. Who knows if it'll work? Who knows if it plays out that way? Russia may collapse the military forces. Putin may wake up and have a night before Christmas moment. We don't know. It's all pretty up in the air. But yeah, it's a bit of a terrifying countdown clock that, Putin knows that if this thing can last till winter, the Russians are fine. The economy is pretty much where it's going to be, but the Europeans will have a much harder time because, again, the gas will affect everything. If gas prices are higher, then food prices are higher, then petrol prices are higher, then everything's higher, and you end up just this perpetuating cycle. Mm-hmm. So it's a big problem coming up.
Michael, it seems like so much of this is around the messaging that people are getting. So you talked about American distraction around our own internal issues around an election cycle, messages that people are going to get in Europe, messages that people will get from the Russians, sort of a propaganda and things like that. What weight does, media disinformation, propaganda have compared to what would seem intuitively to look at as a hard power issue? As Russia's a very big, strong country, but it seems it's much more subtle.
Again, it has huge weight because again, it's that not only will you may weight on your decision makers. So already there are members of U.S. Congress who are voting against Sweden and Finland joining NATO. That's already been happening. There are people will start to see very, very targeted ads. And again, with social media, you can be super targeted with your ads. It's always really interesting working in politics when you can go door to door and do door knocking, and you'll knock on someone's door and you say, hey, what's your big issue of the election? And they go, oh, I don't like that the Democrats are banning pickup trucks. And you go, well, they're not doing that. And they go, yeah, but they are. I saw it on Facebook. And you go, okay. And again, to you, to me, to people who don't drive a pickup truck, we never would have seen that ad. We had Brittany Kaiser from Cambridge Analytica who ran the Brexit and the Trump campaign on a few months ago, about a year ago now on the show. And her words to us were, look, at about 25 likes, we know you better than your colleagues. And about 50 to 75 likes, we know you better than effectively your close friends. At 100 likes on your Facebook and a bit of your data, we know you better than your spouse. And at 150 likes, we know you better than you. And again, these guys can hyper target things because they don't have to run these big ads going, how great is Trump? They'll run an ad saying, pickup trucks are going to be banned in this particular town in Delaware, because they can target that. And that's really, really targeted stuff. So as much as we may not see the disinformation, there is a lot of disinformation out there. And it's particularly prevalent in Telegram groups, Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups, where there isn't that public face to be moderating things. If it's a Twitter thread or something, there's often going to be someone on Twitter who could actually, weigh in and go, hey, that's not how it is. They're not doing that. But it's in a WhatsApp group or a Telegram group. Now that's where disinformation really gets echo chambery, particularly in Telegram groups and VK groups, which is what the Russians tend to use. The messaging can be really dire, and you'll start to see things like, we sent X billion dollars to Russia. Why? We could be feeding homeless veterans. That kind of messaging that may not be, we need to get out of Ukraine. But it kind of already starts to set that message that when it is brought up, people are going to be more susceptible to it. And again, it's something that's really difficult to fight against because most people don't see the disinformation because, my Facebook isn't set to Louisiana at the moment. And B, I have very different particular likes. I get a million ads for, discount vodka and cheap flights. And that's the difference. So disinformation will play a very, very big role in this one, but it's very difficult to combat. And even, once the lie comes out, an egg-heading glasses and a cardigan saying, well, technically that's not correct, doesn't often win it either.
Yeah. As this goes on, I get messages that seem to be especially optimistic for Ukraine or pessimistic for Russia, that, Vladimir Putin is he's delusional or maybe he's ill, these sort of things. And I wonder, what role do you think his desire for a legacy has in this whole conquest?
Very much so. So Vladimir Putin is it's very hard to know exactly what Putin's thinking, first of all, because in most of these guys who make the speculations of like, oh, I psychoanalyze Putin, haven't got within a mile of him. Because particularly in the last 2 years, but very much since COVID, he's been very isolated. He spends a lot of time alone. He spends a lot of time with his bunkers. And he is taught, if you look at the books he is reading and the little bits of information it's all about, big Russian figures. He wants to see himself. We know he wants to see from public speeches that he wants to see himself as this kind of, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great and Putin the Great, and be up in that level of Russian history. The interesting thing would be that, Putin will always have his security detail with him. He's a bit of a paranoid guy, except when he went camping with Shoigu, about a year before the war. And that was a very big kind of like, that's interesting. Because Shoigu is the defense minister, and Shoigu is very big on, reconquering the old Russian territories and rebuilding the Russian kind of sphere, the core Russian sphere. So, it's interesting that the people he's surrounding themselves are also very much a legacy-based kind of ideology. So, yes, we do think there is a bit of that in this. It's probably a combination of a lot of things. It's probably a combination of Russia assuming that, Ukraine would, fall over like they did in 2014. Russia also assuming that the US has enough political issues domestically that they wouldn't get involved in this. If even myself as a Russia analyst or as a Russia guy who watches this closely, if you had come to me in February and told me that I would see Slava Ukrainia stickers, on bumper stickers in Australia, or I would, be hearing, friends in the really rural bits of Iran giving me reports on Ukrainian cities, I would have laughed at you. It's amazing how much this war has sort of got into everyone's imagination, it got into everyone's talking points. But yeah, for Putin, it's really hard to know. But yeah, I'd imagine legacy probably has a big thing to do with it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. One place where people are obviously paying attention is Germany, for many reasons. And I wonder, what influence do you see this having on Germany? Obviously, they've ramped up their defense budget. It's affecting their energy situation. What stands out to you?
There's a few things to do. I speak with the Germans quite often. One thing that really interests us, obviously, the Germans have a very different system to the US politically. And rather than kind of like Democrats and Republicans, they have to make coalitions because no one gets 50%. And right now, the Germans have this weird coalition of like SDP, which is kind of like a center-left Labour Party. I mean, by Americans, far left, but center-left for the rest of the world. Another kind of libertarianish party, and then the Greens. And it was this really weird coalition of like, kind of back off government, not really, bit of social democrat kind of stuff. But the Greens got the foreign secretary. The Greens were in charge of defense, which you wouldn't think of, your environmentalists as the guys in charge of defense. But then Ukraine dropped and we all went, okay, how are the Greens going to handle this one? and they did spectacularly. They jumped the first couple of weeks. They pretty much admitted, they went, everyone was mocking Germany in the first few weeks, going, why would you send just like 3 vans worth of helmets? And then everyone went, oh shit, that's all Germany has. Because again, it's been this real big thing in German psyche. If you talk to sort of Germans who are on the ground, that as soon as any politician mentions we need to remilitarize and really build up our military again, it just sends off alarm bells everywhere, and everyone doesn't want. There's obviously a legacy there. Don't mention the war. So people haven't tended to pay too much attention to the military. And again, they have defense from the United States. No one's invading Germany. I don't think they're worried about, Poland invading Germany. Now this has come back in. It's brought up 2 really big conversations. One, how reliant the Germans have become on Russian gas, Russian oil, and Russian money, which again is a very difficult thing to turn off overnight. And again, it's really hard to understand how close these guys are together. Angela Merkel was effectively one of the Putin whisperers. She spoke with Putin. Helmut Kohl, the former Chancellor of Germany, was head of Russia's biggest oil company until very recently. It's German government is very, very tiny with the Russian government, and they have been for energy and all sorts of things for a long time. For defense, they just weren't ready. And it's an interesting sort of kettle of fish as well, with the British leaving the European Union, as who is going to be the kind of defense guys in Europe, because the French are, they've got enough on their plate in Africa at the moment. The UK usually are the kind of the gun-ho defense guys inside Europe, but they're not technically European Union anymore. So who will be the guys in charge of effectively defending everything? I don't think it'll be Germany still, but it's definitely put that back on the table. And I think this has given pretext for, the German army to effectively go, look, we actually need to be prepared for something like this. And I think this is one of the only things I think they could have shaken that, let's not replay the war, don't rearm the Germans.
What options do you think Germany has for energy? There's been discussion of nuclear reactors in Germany, things like that. What do you notice?
So nuclear reactors are a really interesting one, because on the surface it looks like the solution to the problem, and you go, yep, it's clean, it's safe, it's wonderful. But then you end up with a bit of extra problems. One, they take a long time to build, and they're very, very resource intensive. So even if, let's say, they go, okay, let's all get off gas tomorrow and do coal, do nuclear power plants, you're going to end up actually finishing construction in like 10 years time, and winter's coming back before then. It's also very capital intensive. If you go down this road and you put all this money into building these power plants, and then in 5 years gas comes back into the market, there's a lot of people who might abandon that project halfway through. And so there is a genuine worry about that as well. Renewables, obviously, they aren't as efficient as nuclear is, but they're cheap and you can roll them out really quickly. So the Germans are looking at rolling out renewables up north really quickly, particularly wind. Again, it's horses for courses. Wind works really well in the north. Solar, not great for half the year, but the Germans are doing what they can. When they hear this sort of like, oh, Germany's going back to coal plants, yeah, because you need to do that for a few months to make the stopgap. And coal is really, really, to get a coal-fired power plant going is really, really fast and quick. So even if they get it going for a year at a time, or just a year to get back renewables and get renewables to actually be able to take that load, still an amazing feat. But again, we're talking, this is an immediate problem. And if you'd said to Germany, hey, you got to get off Russian gas tomorrow, I mean, most Germans were saying it's a 20-year process. It's a decades-long thing we'll eventually get around to. And this is the problem. They've had to do 20 years of development in effectively 2 months, and everyone's criticizing them half pulling it off.
Yeah. For you, as someone who is looking at all these factors around the world, obviously there's a lot of excitement about green energy, wind, solar. I wonder, what do you think about how important that is for the world compared to other sort of threats? Or is it a way to make countries maybe less dependent on threats like Russia?
Hugely. I mean, energy policy is what shapes so much of geopolitics. Without energy policy, without oil, I don't think the Middle East would be nearly as intense as it has been for quite a while now. Again, we wouldn't be as reliant on the Russians. We wouldn't have to deal with pipelines making huge bits of diplomacy. It just wouldn't be a thing. At the same time, it's a two-edged sword because you go, okay, well, let's get off energy and let's go straight down to all renewables. But then you look at a lot of these nations like Angola, Algeria, even Saudi Arabia is a good example, where 80, 90, even 95% of their economy is oil. So if you go and take out, let's say, oil out of Algeria, even when our oil has a dip in price, Algeria almost collapses. Because again, you've had this decades-long problem of, okay, if I have $1 and I can put it into textile industry, and I'll make like $1.10 back, but if I put it into the oil industry, I'll make $3 back immediately. And people have just kept, like a guy at the casino, have just kept going, nope, I'm going to keep putting on the oil because I make way more money. And in the short term, yep, you 100% do. But when oil, comes out of vogue, and people stop using it, or even just the price dips, that's when you have problems, because effectively you've ignored all of these other industries for oil. And even if you go, oh well, not many people are employed in oil, but yes, you look at even the universities in these countries are like, no, we're canceling all the other courses. It's just you are making oil now. It's all engineers and that's about it. So it's a real problem that as much as getting off oil and getting off energy and getting off fossil fuels is really important for not only the environment, but to sort of be able to claw back some geopolitics here. But at the same time, there's a lot of countries that the moment you take that away, it will be internal collapse. Because again, it would be like gutting 95% of the economy overnight. And that's something that, I don't think anyone's really ready for, because it will be real nasty there for a while.
Mm-hmm. So maybe to transition to talk of another part of the world. As I understand it, China makes a lot of the solar panels that come to the U.S. What is the motivation for, if this energy is so valuable, what is the motivation for China to be producing things like that and to create this this movement of solar panels into the U.S.?
Well, just because it's profitable at the moment. China has this, much lower. It has this little great niche of themselves that they are amazing for manufacturing, and they can build lots of things in very large capacities. And when you're, let's say, in international business, you're looking for a few things where am I going to set up my factories? You look at, okay, I need someone with cheap labor, so that cuts, Australia, the US, cuts those guys out. Okay, I need somewhere with stable power. Well, that cuts out, Bangladesh and some of the sort of, other African countries. Okay, I need somewhere where bureaucracy will be fine. I know that I can, I pay my license, and in a year's time, I know that, solar panels will come from the factory and arrive at the port in Shenzhen. Yeah, that kind of cuts India out. India's a bit of a bureaucratic mess in the middle, and there's a lot of protectionist policies, and you're paying customs fees as provinces as you travel across the country. So you're kind of stuck with only really a few countries. You're really stuck with China, Vietnam, Taiwan, but labor price is much more expensive, and that's that's about it. Like, you really are kind of stuck. Indonesia's starting to get there, but they've still got a long way to go for infrastructure. So China right now is where most of these guys are basing their manufacturing on. So by default, they get a lot of it. But China likes to concentrate industries. So we see this with particularly rare earths, microchips, all sorts of stuff, where China goes, this is a really important industry. So they will buy the way into it. They'll get really good at it, and they will run it at a loss. Because for China, it doesn't really matter. If it's a state company, it doesn't matter if it makes the loss. They don't have shareholders to really answer to like the Americans do. American rare earth plant goes, 2 years and loses money both years. The shareholders pull out. The whole thing goes belly up. China can just afford to lose that money. They're just happy to, because they know that, as rare earths as an example, that they entered the market, they undersold the market, and then all of the American guys went bankrupt because everyone that bought those products went, well, why would I buy from the Americans at $100 when I can buy from China at 50? So everyone went and bought the Chinese stuff. The Americans lost all their business. The Americans went bankrupt. China had 100% of the industry. Then they can put their prices back up. So they can play a lot longer games. So with industries that they think will be really important going forward, whether that be solar panels or semiconductors or microchips, they do tend to buy up lots in the market because they can either undercut everyone else, and that really, really hurts particularly profit-driven guys like the West, or they can effectively just consolidate and get really good at it, which, again, China's looking at this economically or even environmentally and going, put aside the environmental argument, solar is pretty damn cheap. It's the sun, it's right there. So why wouldn't we invest in lots of solar panels? And even if right now profit-wise, it doesn't make sense for the Chinese to use solar at the same rate the US is. As solar panels are produced more and more and more cheaply and more cheaply, it is going to be, there will be a rate where it does get cheaper than coal for China, and that's when it'll be very, very mass done. Right now it is still done, but there is a sort of profit rate where it's maybe not as viable in some of the rural and outer bits of China than it is compared to some of the major cities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what you were saying there about rare earth metals too, the Redline podcast has done an excellent explainer video about rare earths and how they affect industries like smartphones, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. I'll put a link to that in the description for everyone who's listening, but that was very eye-opening for me. On China still, when Russia moved into Ukraine, then there became this discussion of China will move into Taiwan. What do you think of that logic?
I mean, and that was the big thing everyone was watching. China is taking very, very close notes at the moment on how not only the Americans and Ukraine is responding to effectively, because a lot of the Chinese military equipment is it's Russian equipment with a nice fresh coat of paint. But how the world has rallied around it. I mean, Russia has a very different economy to China. Russia has effectively it's a I don't particularly believe it, but I think it's pretty funny to call them it's a gas station with nukes. And they have lots and lots of fossil fuels, which the demand and elasticity for doesn't change all that much. Whereas China, a lot of their consumption, a lot of the things they make actually are, they won't, people are much more willing to throw that aside if things were to hit the fan. So China knows that if the world were to really buckle down and do sanctions like they have to the Russians, which again, we'll get into that would really, really hurt China. Would the world actually be willing to go that hard on China? Probably not. We don't buy as much from the Russians unless you are in Europe. The Americans only buy so much vodka. It's not, the huge part of the economy like it is with China. As for Taiwan, it's a bit of a different kettle of fish. So Taiwan is a bit of a nasty island to try and take. It is, as much as it's quite a big island with a population of 23 million. There are only 6 beaches that can actually be invaded. The rest of them are either such soft sand that your tanks just into the ground, or they're just sheer cliffs to which no one's going to climb that. So it makes an invasion really much easier to defend. So if you're Taiwan, you can go, okay, let's build defenses on these 6 or 7 beachheads. At the same time, you've got to cross the Taiwan Strait, which is not a small feat. I mean, we talk about the monumental sort of D-Day landings in 44, and they were across just a couple of kilometers on territory that they knew pretty well, and had surprise. The Germans were pretty unaware of what was coming. You couldn't pull it off today. Not only do the Chinese not have enough amphibious vehicles to take on this project, which again, if they were to go and really start building amphibious capable vehicles right away, we go, okay, maybe we need to start thinking about Taiwan a bit differently. But we also have satellites. You put more than 100 of these things in a place and we're probably going to notice, to which then the US decide what they do with the carrier fleets, and we can put carrier fleets in there. And there then comes in, and yourself, you were in the defense forces, from what I understand, you'll know better than most that, even if the Chinese get their boots on the ground and they take the beach and they feel all high and mighty about it, once the US Air Force comes in and once they gain back air supremacy, supply becomes incredibly difficult. And you'll know how quickly you burn through ammunition. You'll be burning through fuel, ammunition, and by day 3, you're just a badly dressed tourist. You're sitting there in a Chinese army uniform with no bullets left, no fuel, and from that point, you're not really much of a threat to the Taiwanese people. Mm-hmm. So it's a very difficult prospect for them to take Taiwan. It's nothing like Ukraine where they can just walk over the border. It's a whole other kettle of fish. But again, we also have to take into account they did say by 2049 it will be part of China. Again, that was said by Xi, who will not be in power by 2049. And I can also say, hey, someone else will do these dishes and then leave the house. It's not my problem at that point. It will be when I get home, but it's a whole kettle of fish. When it comes to sort of actually taking Taiwan, people have speculated there's much more likelihood of doing things like really investing into Taiwanese politics and effectively making a party that would be willing to do something like a Hong Kong style situation, which again, having met a lot of Taiwanese, I can't see that happening. But again, it's to invade Taiwan would either have to be a godforsaken campaign of just real nasty, airstrikes and airborne guys, and lots of amphibious landings. To which, if the US is the same kind of US it is now, they would 100% be willing to, be fighting the Taiwanese. They may not be willing to bomb China, itself and actually go and bomb the Chinese mainland. But yeah, they'll definitely try and take air supremacy and keep that Taiwanese strait clean. And at that point, even if the Chinese get ashore, it's not really, the be all end all. So yeah, it's a bit of a, it's a very different kettle of fish, Taiwan, than Ukraine is for the Russians.
Mm-hmm. And with China having, a new aircraft carrier rolling out, what effect do you think that the ability to move essentially an airbase on the water has for them? And you've done amazing in-depth work on aircraft carriers and how Taiwan is a non-peer power, so they may not necessarily be able to fight back in the way that like a peer power would.
So with an aircraft carrier, against a major power, it's a bit different. With a US aircraft carrier against a Libya or an Iraq, you're parking 90 top of the line fighters against a nation that probably has like 10 or 12, or they have 30, but they're really old fighters. Mm-hmm. So you have air supremacy from day one. Against someone like China or the US, a Chinese aircraft carrier is not going to give them air supremacy against the entire US coastline. Mm-hmm. So, aircraft carriers are a very different kettle of fish when going against major powers. And China right now is effectively looking at things in island chains. So the first island chain is effectively the South China Sea. And right now, the Chinese can pretty much guarantee they'll be fine in that area just because they have so many anti-ship, anti-air, area denial weapons sitting in mainland China who can reach anywhere in the South China Sea. Hunky-dory, we're good in the first island chain. Get out to the second, and that's where you actually have to start competing with the US, and you don't have all these land-based missiles to defend you. So, again, fighting a peer power, I don't think this aircraft carrier is going to change much. What it will do, though, is allow the Chinese to put area denial and air supremacy against a minor power. So, for instance, this would be very important if they need to secure their positions in Gwadar and Pakistan, or they want to get more involved in African politics, or they want to get more involved in Middle East politics. Because, again, that aircraft carrier would make a very big difference in those conflicts. In the South China Sea one, it's a bit harder to see. But it's also a member of prestige. It is if China does put an aircraft carrier off the coast of the Solomons, that actually means something. If China just puts a frigate off the coast of the Solomons, I mean, sure, I can give you a cruise ship as well. It's not going to change. It's not going to change the entire geopolitical sphere. It's a big move by the Chinese, and it does show that their ambitions are outside of the first island chain. Because if it was just we're just caring about Chinese waters, you wouldn't get an aircraft carrier. You just build more and more of these anti-ship missiles and the hypersonics and a few other things. If they really want to, this is an indication that they are looking to be more adventurous in the next decade or so.
Mm-hmm. Again, to the hard power versus messaging, propaganda, disinformation. Does China have means to influence Taiwan to their ends in a similar way that other countries can be influenced?
So it's a really interesting sort of dynamic here of appealing to your aristocracy, your power makers, your lawmakers, and appealing to the general masses. Mm-hmm. So a really interesting test case would be something like Kyrgyzstan, which is borders Central Asia, borders China. If you look at the sort of the Kyrgyz leadership and the Kyrgyz very rich and oligarchic class, they like China. China invests a huge amount of money into the country, and China's very embedded into their political systems. Even Kyrgyz, CCTV, the camera will get you in Bishkek, and it will go all the way to a server in China, and then it will come back to Bishkek for analysis. To which, that's interesting. And the first thing you notice when you fly into Xinjiang is that they use the same brand of stuff. Whole other kettle of fish. China when you actually speak to people on the ground in Kyrgyzstan, there's a lot of xenophobia. There's a lot of these Chinese come here, they ruin things, they do this, they do that, and they haven't made the cultural impact in these areas. Even spending time in Iran, there is still blue jeans and people know who the Simpsons are. You can go to the backest, weirdest bits of, the old Soviet republics and people still know who Santa Claus is. There's still a lot of American culture and soft power that's got around the place. I still get in a cab and hear a terrible Russian cover of an Ed Sheeran song because it's, the Western culture has reached these areas. Whereas I can't think of many times I've got in a cab and I've heard, Chinese pop blasting in the stereo. But it hasn't made that huge impact like American culture has. So they may be going after in Taiwan some of the apparatchiks, the oligarchs, the communications guys, the big top, but your general public haven't been responding as well to it, and they aren't responding as well to it. So, to get them to vote for a pro-China party, it would have to be a monumental shift. Already they're very embedded in the economy, so a huge amount of real estate and communications and industries are bought or owned in part by the Chinese government or owned by Chinese conglomerates, but they haven't made that cultural impact. So if China, let's say, wanted to run the country, so to speak, kind of decide economic policies, they might in 2 decades have enough sway to be able to pull it off. Like they do, they're very big decision makers in places like the Philippines and South Korea and Japan. But when it push comes to shove and cultural stuff comes in, they're not going to win that one because they haven't done some of the real culture stuff. So I think a really interesting test case is, I think it's Vanuatu. Don't quote me on that, but it's one of the Pacific Islands. It's either Palau or Vanuatu, where China came in and built a power station, which is great. The entire oligarchic class loved it. But Taiwan came in and supported and pretty much bought all of the local soccer teams and all the local rugby teams. So they were all wearing jerseys that were like, we love Taiwan. Mm-hmm. And that actually did a lot more to win the opinion of the sort of the general public than the power station makes much more of an impact on the general public, but they don't really notice. They flick a switch, the power comes on, fantastic. But they do notice the guys in the Taiwan jerseys. So, it's a strategy. They've been targeting the sort of the power makers, but they haven't done enough to really target the general public and the people who would support them in case of some sort of revolution or invasion.
Mm-hmm. Michael, with the ever creeping influence of all of this digital media, for you as someone who does this every day, how do you think people can protect their minds from messages and get down to the truth?
Okay, so for me, I have a bit of a rule with things. I rank every source from 1 to 10, and I rank, where how weird the story is from 1 to 10 as well, and start to, play them off, see and get to a certain number. So if I have one person I really, really trust who comes to me with a pretty crazy story, I give them a 7 for trust, but the story is a 2, it's a 9. Not willing to pull the trigger on it. If someone comes to me, if 3 people come to me, but it's a crazy story, well, I need probably 4 before I feel comfortable saying anything public about it. By doing that and sort of going, I'm not going to believe anything until I get a second source or I get someone I trust saying it, or, that I get lots of corroborating evidence, so lots and lots and lots of ones. And I go, okay, there's a lot of the big web here of information I can actually start to patch together. That's when I feel comfortable making this is a thing. And this is the real, and I really do feel, it's a real problem for journalists at the moment, that if you are, you're really big on your integrity, you want to actually wait and get a second source and make the phone calls and do proper journalism, great. Your integrity's, hey, you're doing well, but you're about 12 hours behind the guy who didn't care and he tweeted it anyway. And by that point, he's got all the retweets and the article clicks and everything. And you're putting out a story that's now 12 hours old, and we're all ADHD people now. So all of us go, oh, what? That's still happening? Cool, sure, whatever. And that's the real trouble for journalists, is they have editors yelling at them saying, you need to be out first, breaking the story. You need to get the first one on. But if you're out first, it means there's probably not a lot of sources corroborating it. And that's the real balance that a lot of people are trying to struggle with at the moment. So, everyone asks why Redline doesn't do like breaking commentary every single day. It's because I don't want to. People call me all the time and they go, hey, what's going on over here? And I go, okay, I've spoken to 2 sources. This is what I know. Okay, well, do you want to come on the show and make a comment? No, talk to me in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, the dust has settled. I've spoken to enough sources. I feel really comfortable. The analysis has come back. Yeah, I feel really comfy talking about it in 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. But that's, it is really tough if you were a journalist chasing clicks, that you are consistently struggling between journalistic integrity and, being 2 days behind everyone else.
Well, Michael, thank you for being that sort of journalist. It's it's really a pleasure to listen to your work. And before I get to some rapid fire questions from your fans, could you just tell people where they can find your work?
You can find us on all the usual podcast places with Spotify and Apple and all the usual ones under the Redline Podcast. And otherwise, we're on YouTube, we're on TikTok, all the other stuff. We're putting out lots of content, whether it be analysis pieces and written articles. We do sort of 1 minute explainer videos. We do 3 minute animated videos. And then every fortnight we do a big 90-minute piece on something like are aircraft carriers becoming obsolete, or the nuclear weapons black market, or the Libyan civil war. Just a big 90-minute analysis, really going into the details of what's going on there. It is a back in the day when you do these TV appearances, they go, okay, cool, you're on air in 2 hours and you have 90 seconds to explain the Libyan civil war, and that used to drive me up the wall because 90 seconds you really can't explain very much. So the whole show is designed to be much longer, much more in depth, much more going into the history, why it's happening, and why would it impact the region? Because in 90 seconds you can only give a good guy, bad guy, shoot, bad. Whereas we hope to be a bit more deeper than that.
Yes, much deeper. And we'll put links in the description for people who are interested in finding your show and your website and your Twitter. And Michael, some questions from your fans. This one actually comes from another YouTube channel, popular geopolitics YouTube channel called Geopop. And,
I know those guys, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Great. Also Australian.
Yep.
Yes. And they're wondering, do you like Peter Zion? And what other analysts do you like?
I like lots of analysts, and it really depends on what I'm talking about. Peter Zion's a really interesting character. I think he's I'm not going to throw anyone under the bus. I think a lot of his takes are good. A lot of them are a little bit far for my personal taste. I tend to favor more of the really boring, the people I love to listen to are the guys who've, let's say, worked for the State Department doing Eastern Turkmenistan for 35 years. They are the most boring, awful people to have dinner with, but boy God, do they know what's going on over there. They know the general's dog's name. They know what streets have potholes. Those guys are great, but they're very boring. I think Peter's a really, really good speaker and really good at actually putting across information. Again, it's one of those things that when Peter says something, he gets a good level of trust, but I tend to want a second or third source to kind of back things up.
Mm-hmm. So what other analysts do you like?
Again, it really comes down to what theater it is. So someone like, for instance, China stuff, Eric Gomez is always a really good go to me. I'm a big fan of guys like Sheena Greitens. She's really good for sort of China stuff. Stephen Pfeiffer's really good for Ukraine. Scott Rowland's really good for, wider geopolitics. Michael Ziegler's really good for Russian internal politics. Carl Schreck's really good for, domestic Russian politics. It really just depends on what theater. I have a kind of Rolodex that everyone's kind of put in their little special zones. And when, like my producer sort of hit me up this evening talking about doing sort of Russian money laundering in the UAE, and I went, okay, cool. And just went to like my usual Russian money laundering guys. And I was like, okay, let's see what you've got on this and go from there. So guys like Tom Burgess, for instance, is really, really good with that. Again, I just, because of the way the show is, where we're doing crazy deep dives for 2 weeks at a time, I am usually buried, like absolutely in my mind. That's all I'm thinking about for 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. I will get to know every single analyst for those 2 weeks, and then I won't think about, I will know the South America analytical community really well, and then I won't think about them again for about 8 weeks. As much as I love those guys, but yeah, it really is just depending on what I'm looking at the time.
Yeah. Well, that covers another question which people were asking. How do you pick your guests? Because it is amazing how tailored your guest list is to your topic.
So usually we try and do a bit of a narrative structure. Mm-hmm. So the first guest is often someone who's a bit more historical, can kind of give a bit of context. Mm-hmm. We kind of imagine everyone has a bit of geopolitical knowledge. But the first guest is usually kind of there to smooth stuff out. And then we kind of want a bit of contradictory guests. See, this is the trouble. If you have one guest, then you only get one opinion. Right. So we try and give guys who are all, we're not getting extremist people. We're not getting, a far left hippie and a far right conspiracy. We're not getting Alex Jones and, the vegan teacher on. We're not going to do that. But, guys who have slightly different viewpoints on things, whether it be, a more American point of view or a more a bit more gun-ho with their opinion. When you read analysts' work, some of them are a bit more hawkish, others are a bit more reserved, and we kind of try and get a bit that play off each other. So usually when we pick guests, myself and the staff will effectively go and pick our top 10, dream gets. That's who we really want. And effectively we'll start vetting them. So going through previous speeches, going through some of their work, seeing what their opinion's probably going to be. So by the time we actually sit down with them, we have a pretty good idea on what they're going to tell us. Some surprise us. There are some who, we can solve the Cyprus problem by simply sinking it into the sea. I'm like, oh, that is not going on the tape. But most of them you can generally tell what they're going to say. So effectively that's how we start to go, okay, here are our 3 kind of archetypes we want. So it'll be, we want someone who has probably lived through it, someone who understands the culture, someone who can tell us why this is important. We want someone who can give us a whole regional perspective. So they may not be, let's say, a Kosovo expert, but they'll be a Balkans expert. And then we'll probably have someone who will either give us the other side of it, or will give us this is why it's happening. I don't agree with it, but here's the narrative, and try and build a story around it. Because again, you don't want just information for 90 minutes. That sounds, it sounds like a dictionary and tumble dryer at that point. What you want is a bit of a narrative to it where you can go, okay, I get the Yugoslav wars. Okay, I get why Kosovo has a hard time becoming independent. Oh, and now I get why China is actually putting money into this project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What topics are you following most closely right now?
My main work has been Central Asia and the former Soviet states. So I'm always buried in Central Asia stuff. So I get to pronounce all the most lovely names of all time, like Turkmenistan's former president, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov. I get to say that all the time. So Central Asia is always right in my purview. But generally, Ukraine is always taking up a lot of my time at the moment. But again, it comes down to that 2 weeks. So for instance, right now we are finishing up our cyber war in Ukraine piece. So I've been buried in cyber documents and lots of Ukraine stuff all week. And I'm just sort of getting into an episode we're doing on Turkish influence in the Middle East. So I've already started getting lots of Turkish papers on my desk, and my staff are getting briefing papers put together. And I'm, I think from tomorrow afternoon is when I officially switch from one episode to the other. So I will be pretty much pushing all the Ukraine stuff off my desk and just putting a bunch of Turkey on my desk. So again, it really comes down to what episode we're doing at the time. And we usually do about 3 episodes at a time. We have a cycle. Mm-hmm. So this will be the midway to the end of this cycle. And we're sort of, So 2 weeks ago, I was buried in aircraft carriers. This week, buried in computers and Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. What country would scare you most to enter?
Ooh, that's a real interesting one. I'm not allowed in Israel because I've been to Iran and a few other places. Scare me the most? That's a really good question. I've never been asked that one. The Central African Republic's pretty rough at the moment. I don't think I feel particularly comfy in there, but I'd still go just out of curiosity. Democratic Republic of Congo, I think, is the only one I've knocked back a job offer for, because I had a friend of mine who runs a mine out there, and some of the stories and photo videos he's shown me are pretty horrific. I think even that would break my happy-go-luckiness. I'd say DRC is probably one of the only ones I'd feel that I would either have to, if I was going to go in, I want to know, that I have a good fixer and that I'm having protection and everything else. Whereas, put me in a lot of countries tomorrow and I'll muddle my way through it. But yeah, I think DRC would be the one I would draw the line at.
Sure. Yeah. Michael, what books are you reading?
Ooh, right now I am rereading On Grand Strategy because I've read that a couple of times, but I'm getting my head back into it. I'm about to start a book on Turkey, which I can't remember which one it is. I know it's just on my pile. I just finished. It's like the Indo-Pacific Strategy one by Rory Medcalf, which is really good. I've got Kevin Rudd's book somewhere around here. I said I'd read that for, I'll get to it eventually. But yeah, always a couple books on the go. And then, I can't remember what other. Yeah, but those are the main ones I'm reading at the moment. It'll be Turkey, Asia aircraft carriers, you can see the cycle where I'm kind of exiting one and getting into the other. But it's also not unusual that, again, the red line is a staff of 15 and my researchers are absolutely fantastic. And it's not unusual that they might say, hey, look, please read this book, chapters 12 to 16. That's the bit you need. Don't worry about the bit before. I know you'd find it interesting, but we don't need you to talk about Vanuatu this week. So just 14 to 16, and I'll end up just trying to peruse through them. So it really depends. But I'm also a giant audiobook guy. I'm constantly have an earpiece in. So yeah, if your book's on audiobook, you're about 10 times more likely for me to read it these days.
What books would be in your starter pack for people who wanted to get a sense of your work?
So the book I recommend to everyone to start with is The Prisoner's Geography by Tim Marshall. And Tim's lovely in person. He's the most sarcastic man I've ever met in my life, and I love him for it. In fact, he actually narrates some of his audiobooks, particularly his ones about him in the Balkans in the 90s were great. That's a really, really good place to understand the very basics of geopolitics. The idea that every country is kind of in it for themselves and they all have their own completely different, hand of cards dealt. This idea that someone like America was dealt a really, really good hand of cards. They've got great internal waterways that run north-south and east-west. They've got no one who's a big power anywhere near them. They've got 2 oceans to deal with, great farmland, multiple climate zones. It is the best possible hand of cards. And then you get Tajikistan, who was dealt the worst hand of cards, who is just a mountainous mess where nothing really works or grows. Every country is given this hand of cards, and they have to play the hand of cards they're dealt. Even something like Russia, which is this giant nation, only has like 4 walkable ports half the year. It's things like that you go, okay, wow, I didn't even think about that, and that completely shapes how you play the game. Because for Russia, for instance, their port problem, that makes huge impacts on everything to do with geopolitics. So I always, people ask me, where do you start in geopolitics? Tim Marshall's Prisoner's Geography is a pretty good crash course if you're going to go start there. And that'll give you an idea on branching from that.
Awesome. Well, Michael, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me and for doing the thorough, careful work that you do. I really enjoy it.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm happy to come on anytime.